Was in 1883 they began. So technically speaking, many would say that was the beginning of cultural diplomacy. I argue in a recent book I did with Professor Jessica Hecht called Searching for a Cultural Diplomacy that it actually began much earlier. That really the first time that you had human beings or pilgrims of any sort moving from one situation to another, whether it was in colonial times or much, much earlier, that actually was the beginnings of cultural diplomacy. Those interactions that were actually very natural between people coming from different cultures. They didn't call it cultural diplomacy. They didn't necessarily have the intention of cultural diplomacy. But if we go back to this reference I made yesterday about cultural diplomacy being about building trust, building understanding, this exchange of cultures and values, that's actually what it's about. So I would argue cultural diplomacy is nothing new. And it began really as something by the people, for the people. And I would argue if we fast forward to today, that's happening as well. This is no longer just the business of governments anymore. We feel at the Institute the private sector has a very large role to play, as well as a large responsibility, as well as civil society. That's why I'm so looking forward to this panel. We really have three individuals coming really more from the private sector point of view, even though Mr. Scott, as we just heard, is much more than just private sector. I don't want to put anyone in boxes here. But I would really love this discussion to be more focused on the role of the private sector. We've discussed already the governmental role in a number of the lectures. We've discussed already the civil society, especially with the brilliant keynote address this morning of Mr. Scott. What I'd love to dedicate this discussion to is really, what can companies do? What can the private sector do when it comes to cultural diplomacy? Now, very often, one of the challenges with this, of course, is companies say, what's the benefit? Why should I sponsor this? Why should I sponsor that? Is that really going to help me? I prefer to do action A, B, and C, where I can see the concrete results. One of the challenges with cultural diplomacy, very often you don't see the results quickly. Academic exchange, for example, everyone in this room would probably agree, great thing. Academic exchange, Fulbright, German Academic Exchange Service, Erasmus, traveling abroad, living abroad, getting to know the situation. Although, how do you prove it? How do you put it on a budget sheet and tell, Deutsche Bank or BMW, if you invest this amount of money in academic exchange, you're going to get this amount of a reward? So I think that's one challenge I'd like to discuss today as well, in the sense, what is the benefit for companies, if there is a benefit? And secondly, is it also possible through, let's say, corporate cultural diplomacy initiatives to actually improve the performance of companies? For example, if you have a company that has, factories or investments in a certain country, might there also be a benefit by having cultural diplomacy initiatives also with that country? Could that even in some cases assist in the company's performance? So what I'd like to do is maybe begin with Mr. Sicat, because actually I haven't had a chance to introduce you yet, but he's actually, I think, traveled the furthest for this conference. Mr. Sicat is the CEO of the Philippine Stock Exchange. So in that sense, his daily business, having been really your whole life in the consulting industry and in the private sector, I think your perspectives on the one hand from the stock exchange are very important, also from the Philippines. So I'll give a more proper introduction to Mr. Sicat later today for his keynote address, but those are the key facts for now, sort of from the Philippine Stock Exchange. Would you mind maybe offering a few words to begin, in the sense as you reflect on this issue of corporate cultural diplomacy? Is there any sense for the private sector to be involved with this? And if so, what sense?
Well, thank you for that. Maybe what I can do is actually talk about the Philippine experience to give some concrete examples and what we're trying to look forward to. Now, clearly from our point of view, the interaction of the corporate sector is a must. I think you saw one of the slides from Mr. Scott earlier, which talked about the requirement that actually it is a corporate sector which is helping fund a lot of these initiatives that you might argue are helping alleviate poverty. And if I can think of maybe three very quick examples in the Philippines, there's actually an NGO in the Philippines called the Philippine Business for Social Progress. It's actually a grouping of, started out with the major corporations, of which the Philippine Stock Exchange is one of the members. And the main goal is really trying to help alleviate poverty. How do we do it? The idea is to encourage, actually, since we cannot force, encourage companies to actually contribute perhaps up to about 1% of their pre-tax income, operating income, into this fund. And we actually have professionals running the whole organization and essentially driven to trying to address this issue of poverty across the nation. Now, in a place like the Philippines, which is probably like many of the other developing economies, you're going to see that the differential between, let's call it the top 1 or 2%, is actually truly multiples greater than maybe 28 times that we heard earlier to those who are in the bottom rung. And clearly, with very tight budgets from the government side, it's something that the government cannot do, and actually requires the help of various NGOs. So that's actually one level of maybe concrete help that the corporate sector is probably rallying around. Now, clearly, the jargon goes to the so-called corporate social responsibility box, which I guess corporates also like putting in their annual reports or talking about, because shareholders do ask about it. But actually, there's probably an even more important reason why something like this should be actually practiced by various corporations. Now, in the Philippines, we're actually in one sense, trying to copy a model from Brazil. In Brazil, about 12, 15 years ago, they thought of developing something called the Novo Mercado. And what that is what's called a special good governance block of companies. In other words, those who have very high standards of corporate reporting, disclosure, as well as corporate social responsibility as part of their programs. And companies which actually have qualified in this sector, when you take a look at statistics over 10, 11 years, interestingly enough, the values of those corporations are actually higher than, let's say, the Bovespa index. So clearly, from you might argue, a very selfish financial perspective, involvement of corporations in good corporate governance, which includes, as I said, the CSR portion, may make sense, although of course it might not be easily measurable on a day-to-day basis. And perhaps thirdly, as I mentioned, that we in the Philippines, at the Philippine Stock Exchange, are trying to look at this concept of the Novo Mercado. We're actually trying to put together our own version of this good governance board, and we've now started giving awards on a good corporate governance level, and we hope that those who we actually recognize will form the basis of this good governance market.
Thank you very much. Mr. Scott, maybe if I may, I'd like to turn to you now. I think you made the point very clear in your lecture, of course, the responsibility and the great potential that there is in civil society, and we can put maybe the faith-based organizations in the box of civil society for now. You've spent much of your life in the private sector, so I'd like to ask you the same opening question in the sense, is culture diplomacy just the business of civil society and government? Is there a role also for the private sector to play? And if so, what role might that be? And even if you have some specific examples, would be excellent.
I wish I were more of an expert in this subject, but I will say a few things here. First, how corporations treat their employees is a fundamental part of the picture. The high-tech industry figured out about 15 years ago that they could produce their products a lot cheaper in Asia. What they didn't figure out was how to do that in a way that would be safe and constructive and always positive for their employees. So you have situations like fires in factories that Apple Computer is getting its people not being able to get to exits, child labor, a lot of things that are really on the negative side of the corporate social responsibility scale. But I think these things have, so that companies like Nike and Apple and others and Hewlett-Packard have become to realize that they just can't issue a contract and then just let the products roll in, that they have a real role to see that the welfare of their employees overseas, even their contract employees, are adhered to. Secondly, I think foregoing profit is on certain product lines. Examples are antiretroviral drugs. There's not a lot of money to be made in antiretroviral drugs because there's not that much AIDS in the rich world, and in the poor world where there's lots of AIDS, there's no money to pay for the drugs. So you have to find ways to incent companies to continue to produce those kinds of products orphan drugs. Another area are the so-called neglected tropical diseases. There are all these diseases that don't occur in the developing world, even malaria, for example. There's very little malaria in the rich world, and yet, and so as a result, you don't have large amounts of investment going into malaria vaccines. But you do have companies like Sumitomo Chemical, for example, making a resin that has the insecticide impregnated in it, from which the thread is spun, which eventually results in the bed net. Sumitomo doesn't make much money off that, almost no money off that resin, but they do it because it's good for the world. Anglo-American Mining is another example. Anglo-American Mining was the first big mining company to really take on responsibility for HIV/AIDS testing and treatment of its employees. So there are things corporations can do which I think are very important and which don't result in profit to them, but which is a moral imperative they decide to do. I think in the United States, the companies with the worst records are, frankly, the oil companies and the high-tech companies. And I think that if I live long enough, maybe I should start an NGO that tries to beat up on them and get them to be better citizens. Okay. Thank you.
Let me, if I may, just ask a follow-up question, because you raised a very good point. And one of the things I'd also like to discuss in this session is this issue, corporate social responsibility. And I think clearly that's one category in which perhaps cultural diplomacy activities could fall. Let's go back to the example you gave of Apple. Apple Computer, there were recently many scandals regarding China, human rights, etc. And there we saw, of course, the effect that had negative effect of that bad PR for Apple. So it sounds like what you were just mentioning there, one could say there would be a positive PR potential for them, let's say, doing some sort of a constructive activity. First of all, they have to practice what they preach. They have to treat those workers well. That's clear. Otherwise, in today's world, with the internet, WikiLeaks, etc., you're not going to go very far. So that's the first lesson learned. Second lesson learned, and this is where I want to push you a little bit more, is this idea of companies being proactive and actually contributing to the societies and the situations where they're actually working. One good example of that is actually the Canadian company, we can call it, Cirque du Soleil, the circus company. They dedicate, I think it's 1 or 2% of their profit every year to specific grassroots initiatives where they'll work with street children in Latin America, around the world, putting on actually opera circuses with those street kids. And apparently it's had very good results, really empowering these children, really giving them hope. That would be one example where they're engaging. Maybe they're just doing it for image. We'd have to ask them what are the incentives. So would you go further and say Apple Computer not only should do a good job of treating their workers well in China, should they also be doing additional activities, perhaps to reach out to the communities and also to China?
Well, I think the answer is clearly yes, and you just simply have to decide what is the realm of focus that is most appropriate for that company. Education is certainly one where they can help finance and support schools. In the United States, major corporations have certainly been helpful in the arts, performing arts centers, museums, art, supporting individual artists. But most of what I have seen in terms of global reach has been in the area of public health and poverty reduction, as opposed to in the area of cultural, encouraging cultural interaction, which is equally as important for sure. Some of the corporations will bring African dance troupes to the States and give them exposure, African singing groups. And that's very encouraging to those kids because it gives them a window on the world they never would have had. And it certainly gives the people in the States a window on Africa they wouldn't have had. But it's an area where I think that corporations basically pick and choose the things that they're attracted to.
Which I think they should. I think, as you were saying, it should be something relevant. So let's say a computer company could maybe use also the skills and the resources that they have and do something like that. One of our MA students actually made a presentation on, I believe it was Microsoft has this initiative, DigiGirls, where they're actually working also with girls and actually using technology, bringing that in the classroom, etc. So I agree. I think it should fit. It shouldn't just be a random thing they do just to sponsor. But we'll come back to this later. But before we continue on that thread, I'd love to get the perspectives also, Mr. Maric, in the sense cultural diplomacy, going back to the initial question. Is this just the business of governments and civil society? Is there a role for the private sector? You're, I guess, coming from the private sector directly. What role and responsibility do you see?
Yeah, this is a right question in this moment. Corporate cultural diplomacy is a must for today and must for the future. Why? I think that looking in a very close future, that global economy will be worldwide oriented. So for the corporations which tend to be big corporations and successful, they have to orient their business to a global economy. And what is the global economy? Global is economy for the big corporations is economy oriented to cover whole world, like your ex-company. So if you are covering whole world, you have different locations all over the earth. And earth is not sleeping, like money is not sleeping. No, it's always active. So if you have to be successful in a big corporation, you have to understand different cultures. You have to understand different companies. You have to understand different working time. So let's imagine how it could be tomorrow that a big company could organize a business from Japan through India to Europe to US. Yeah, this is a cyclus of one day, but non-sleeping day. A company is working whole day, and it could be a very productive and very successful. So to be successful, have to be a cultural diplomacy oriented. You have to learn and to talk with different cultures and to understand them, to understand different money market, to understand different cultures and heritage and working. So that, for my opinion, it's a must. And technology is helping us because technology is now capable to translate online. Technology is capable to work virtually. What does it mean? On other part of the earth, you could work and virtually it could be online in next period of time. So it could be a non-breaking period of working time.